Hello all, I've decided to review Procol Harum's Live in Concert with the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra as my first review of the year. I've had this album in my collection for around 8 years now, and I'd have to say it's one of my favorite Procol Harum albums, along with its immediate predecessor, Broken Barricades, its immediate successor, Grand Hotel, and the band's second album, Shine On Brightly. I honestly never thought I'd be reviewing a live album. I'm more of a studio album person in general. But this album, for me, was a must-have, not only because of my music collecting nature, but because its leading track was what drew me into Procol Harum's music, even more so than their biggest hit, A Wider Shade of Pale. And as a must-have, it stood out among the other live albums in my overall music collection as a must-review. Before we get into the album's content, a little background on the album and its place in rock music history. By the early 1970s, a number of rock bands, especially in the prog rock subgenre, had experimented with sound textures and musical arrangements that either imitated the sound of having an orchestra or choir backing the band, or, as would become common with some bands, such as the Electric Light Orchestra, actually using an orchestra to accompany recorded album tracks, as opposed to simply relying on in-band talent and multi-track recording tricks. Doing this in a live setting with a large orchestra and choir, though, was largely unheard of going into the 70s. Only a few bands had attempted it at this time, to very mixed results. Procol themselves had experimented with orchestral backing as early as 1969. Having grown more confident with this approach, Procol recorded this performance with the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra in late 1971. There were a number of difficulties leading up to the concert, some technical, but everything pretty much fired on all cylinders, at least to my ears, when I listened to this album. On its release, the album reached number 5 on the Billboard Top 200 in the US, number 7 in Canada, and has a certified gold rating from the Recording Industry Association of America. It's also the band's best-selling album. Now let's take a dive into the individual tracks. Opening this album, Conquistador originally hails from the band's UK debut. According to Keith Reid, the band's lyricist for most of their albums, this song was unusual in that the music was written before the lyrics, an inversion of the usual Harum songwriting formula. Therefore, the Spanish influence in the music structure inspired the lyrics. Conquistador was only rehearsed once before the live performance due to the trouble of getting the band's equipment into Canada. The live cut was issued as a single in the summer of 1972, peaking at number 16 on the Billboard Hot 100. Personally, this and A Wider Shade of Pale were all I needed to hear to be convinced that I'd like Procol Harum's other material. Originally included on their fourth studio album, Home, and definitely being the standout track on an album that otherwise tends to linger heavily on the subject of death, Wailing Stories as a studio recording sounds like it was definitely a logical choice to do in a live setting like this. Even so, the orchestra's presence on the recording tends to be subtle early on, and really only shows itself during the parts where Robin Trower's heavy guitar parts were the focus in the studio recording. The finale of the song, however, is where having the orchestra and the choir really pays off. They took something that already sounded epic and improved it. The studio version of A Salty Dog from the album of the same name was the band's first use of orchestration on their studio recordings, a trend that would continue through the album Grand Hotel. The live version presented here doesn't improve much on the studio cut, but it's still a profoundly sad yet beautiful piece about the living a seafarer makes, with emphasis on the joys of returning to land. The choir doesn't have much presence on this performance, but the orchestra, even with some of the arrangements feeling a bit subdued, really shine. Probably the least known of the 5 songs included on this album, All This and More was originally included on the A Salty Dog album. Early on in this recording, the band is front and center, but the choir eventually makes its presence known in the second half and accompanies the band well. The orchestra, on the other hand, doesn't really present itself until the end of the song, mostly just trumpets, but there really wasn't much to add to this piece. An 18-minute multi-section philosophical piece that originally capped off their second album, Shine On Brightly, the studio version of this piece was brilliant in its own right. But with the orchestra and choir added, it stands out as much on this album as Conquistador. The strings and low hums of the choir fill out the opening segment, Glimpses of Nirvana. As the segment reaches its midpoint, the orchestra blasts into the sonic foreground, along with Brooker's piano and Dave Ball's guitar, as well as some well-coordinated percussion between drummer B.J. Wilson and the orchestra. The choir really sounds beautiful as Glimpses of Nirvana continues. The whimsy on the second segment, 'Twas Tea Time at the Circus, is amplified with the help of the orchestra, but beyond that there isn't much to say in comparison to the studio cut. Segment 3, In the Autumn of My Madness, the emphasis is on Chris Copping's organ work, Brooker's piano, Ball's guitar, but is also well backed predominantly by the orchestra's strings and woodwinds. They also get a good police siren noise from one of the brass players. Use of the whole orchestra near the end of the segment really pays off in generating a great deal of swelling noise where it's needed. It reminds me of the orchestra swells in the Beatles' A Day in the Life. At the segment's end, the coordination between the band, orchestra, and choir is in full force. The fourth segment, Look to Your Soul, makes use of harpsichord during the first 3 quarters where it's just the band playing. When the orchestra comes in, the strings are the most prominent section, but it's only for a brief bit before we reach the finale of the whole piece. The finale comes off as very church hymn-like, with piano and organ from the band being the focus initially, but as the melody of it repeats, the choir comes in along with some brass accompaniment, and continues to add more parts as it goes along, with Brooker's piano still being a prominent band part leading into Dave Ball's guitar solo, where the orchestra and choir take a short break, but when they come back, the piece reaches its full, beautiful climax. Normally, I don't talk about bonus tracks on these reviews, but I felt they were worth mentioning this time. My CD includes the live cut of Luscious Delph, which was released as the B-side to the Conquistador live single. This piece originated on the Broken Barricades album and features some clever wordplay, but is one of those word salad pieces lyrically. The orchestra works well on this live recording. There are some beautiful string and horn parts. The other 2 bonus tracks are rehearsal takes of Simple Sister and Shine On Brightly. This version of Shine On Brightly sounds like they were having trouble miking the orchestra, as it's barely audible and the choir is nowhere to be heard. The band sounds fine, though not as wonderfully rough as they were on the original studio cut. The song's tempo is a bit slower too. I really like this version of Simple Sister. It's a bit more fast-paced than its studio counterpart from Broken Barricades, and the orchestra adds some nice layering to the piece without dulling the guitar's edge. I'm sure there are other amazing examples out there of rock bands backed by an orchestra and or choir, but for me this album is a definitive example of how to do it right. Many music critics at the time seemed to agree. One review from New Musical Express, for instance, said, quote, "The music is some of the finest I've heard. Overall, this is a breathtaking beauty of an album." If you're a big fan of progressive rock, I'd say this album is essential listening.